And more revelations on the presidency, as it says that 9 oil-producing states received 13% derivation, totaling 625.43 billion naira subsidy and refunds from the Federation account in the last 2 years. In a statement, presidential spokesman Garba Shehu listed the states to have received the refunds dating from 1999 to 2021 to include Abia, Akwa Ibom, Bayelsa, Cross River, Delta, Edo. Others are Imo, Ondo, and Rivers states. Abia State received 1.1 billion naira, Akwa Ibom 15 billion naira, Bayelsa 1.6 billion naira, Cross River 432 million naira, Delta 14.8 billion naira, Edo 2.2 billion naira, Imo 2.9 billion naira, Ondo 3.7 billion naira, and Rivers got 12.8 billion naira.
Well, according to Shehu, states also got 64.8 billion naira as a refund of the 13% derivation fund on deductions made by Nigeria National Petroleum Company Limited without payment of derivation to oil-producing states from 1999 to December. That'll be December 2022. All right, we have economist Professor Ken Ife and Arise analyst Dr. Sam Amadi, who is in our off-site studio. Both of you gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us on News Night tonight. Prof, let me start with you, Professor Ken Ife. Where do you draw the line between politics and reality with this, back and forth? First, of course, it was the Minister of State for National Budget and National Planning, Clem Agba, who came out and said, look, governors are stealing. They're stealing the funds. Now the president follows suit and says the same thing. Now you have the governors, pushing back and saying it is uncharitable on the part of the president, but in fact the presidency, to say that the governors are stealing. But what do you make of the figures that have been brought out by the presidency? Of course, some states, Delta, Rivers, featuring huge figures, 110 billion to Delta State, River State 103 billion naira. What do you make of all of this?
Well, let's explain that to viewers so that they know where we are coming from.
Right.
Every year, the fiscal strategy paper sets out the benchmarks, the budget benchmarks. It sets out the expected revenue from oil. Oil is the primary commodity, the price, and the volume, production volume. Now, normally, revenues in excess of those benchmarks are retired into the excess crude account. Now, that excess crude account is still Federation money. So what then happens is that occasions will arise when NNPC will put their hand in the till, and federal government will also put their hand in the till to fund like Shopee or subsidy. Mm-hmm. Now, the technical thing, the question is this: at that material time when you are taking out that money, do you not retire the 13% derivation? Because if you delay the 13% derivation, they can come back and say, look, you should pay us interest for delaying this money, because that money payment is due when you are drawing down on that money. So you can now see how the arrears begin their journey. But the president is right, actually, to say he's not getting enough credit for the work that he has done. If you remember, the very first time he took over the office, all the governors came to him and said that they can't pay salaries. Mm-hmm. He had to call the CBN, they found 600 billion and they shared it out. So what he's actually saying is that he's saying that he is very even-handed when it comes to the affairs of the Federation. That is the affairs of the states and local government, that he's even-handed. He doesn't think about political leaning and all of that he does is even-handed. Mm-hmm. But he doesn't get credit for that. And that's not very fair. But he says he makes exception. For example, Wike and some others that actually do recognize that he tries to be fair. And so the least that one should do is to actually appreciate the fact that he tries to be fair on those occasions. But that doesn't take away the real question, the real question about that money.
Right.
At what point do you take this money, and at what point is the 13% due? That actually is due when you are taking that money out. And then we have to be very careful, because this matters around that thing can head to the Supreme Court.
Court, yeah.
Yes.
Okay, Professor Ife, thanks there. Let's go to our offsite studio where Associate Professor Sam Amadi is there for us. Sam, it's not the politics of the money now, it's the constructive or conscientious use of such humongous money. Within 2 years, we're talking of over ₹500 billion. If you look at the 9 oil-producing states, would you say on what is on the ground, the monies have been used justifiably?
Well, I think you have to predicate this with the recently released multidimensional poverty index. So the Minister of State for Planning spoke more about that. 2 key points. One is that this is also a subtext of the mismanagement of local government by all the governors, and that's the key point President Buhari is trying to make. He has tried to use executive order to solve some of this problem. But let's flash back to Obasanjo's regime when Okonjo-Iweala tried to pass through the National Assembly a fiscal regulatory law that tries to say that when you do those local government transfers, local government entitlement to the state governors, the federal government tried to create a control measure that allows it to ensure that that money goes to local government. Because the constitution says you have to pay it into an account designated by the state. The Supreme Court, wrongly in my view, ruled that it was unconstitutional, that law, because in their view, once the federal government obligation is to transfer that money, and that ends it, that he has no control, no right to control the use of that fund. So what we are saying today is a play out of that decision and the practice in which federal government simply transfers the local government to the state, and the state's joint account with local government is in the control of the state government. Now, government can say, look, we don't steal the money. But the point is, most of these states don't have local government autonomy. Local government appointees are the governor. And in many of them, these funds are not properly transferred to local government. So first point is this. Poverty in Nigeria is largely a rural phenomenon. If you look at the figure from the MBS, it tells you that local governments are where the primary responsibility, the economic investment in social services, in sanitation, access to healthcare ought to happen. Those are primarily functions that local government and states should drive more than the federal government. They're not being done. And so that deepens poverty. And so the central question for me is 2 points. One is structural. If you look at China, for example, the relationship between the regional and the central government is such that regional governments have incentive to invest. In fact, most of the time, village enterprises are not private sector, they are municipal, local enterprises. And from 1987 to up to 1992, over 46% of production in those rural areas are companies owned by the local government. So the question is that our model has so much destroyed local autonomy and economic life that apart from the lack of fiscal accountability, we are suffering huge economic deficit. We have basic things like sanitation, access to healthcare are absent. And so the federal government argument is, look, these guys might not be stealing the money in the literal of stealing. They are diverting this money from the local government where they should have been used by elected local authorities to improve basic human development facilitators. And that's why Nigeria's crisis of poverty, if you look at China, that removed in 15 years or thereabout about 750 million people, you discover that local areas are in control of physical arrangement, they have control over their finances, they're investing in business by themselves, and they are collecting taxes themselves and paying to the federal government, the central government in China, royalties. And it's no magic that China's rural environment is transformed. So this is a crisis of political economy. How do we structure relationship between the federal government and the state? The federal government is hampered. They can't follow the money. They send this money, they can't follow how it's used. And that's the crisis we have here. So it might be true that Wike is not stealing or Otto is not stealing, but the point is that none of them is actually giving that level of fiscal autonomy to these local governments so that these funds are 100% transferred. Let me tell you, when I was going to run for governor in 2018, I had an idea about community participation for progress. And I talked about cottage industry. If you look at the southeastern Nigeria under Amadi, you see that local governments, municipalities, we are investing in cottage industry, and that helped to improve IGR and as well as economic well-being. Today, the local government has no functional economy, has no control over revenue, has no responsibility for the primary care of its people, sanitation, access to healthcare, and education. And that's the crisis.
Let's bring it quickly back to Professor Kenife. Now, is this a good argument for fiscal federalism, true federalism that's been, talked about forever? And come to think of it, this 625 billion naira that's said to have been refunded to, the states over time, how much impact really, realistically, based on the inflation, figures that Nigeria faces over 20% right now? Of course, the poverty level, 133 million out of 220 million people are poor in Nigeria. How much impact really do you think these funds, can make in a way that will reflect in the lives of the ordinary people in the, rural areas?
First and foremost, there is a wisdom in agreeing to allocate 13% of proceeds from crude to states, those littoral states. There's a wisdom there. Mm-hmm. And there's also the fact that the actual quantum of money we are talking about is 2 trillion naira. It's about 2 trillion. So you're only talking about part of it. It's about 2 trillion altogether. Because 1.1 trillion is still out there.
Still outstanding.
It's about 2 trillion. But I'm not going to argue for the state. But one thing I would say, if you look at the debt of the states, 6 of these 9 states are owing between 100 billion to 215 billion dollars and naira. Naira. 6 of those 9 states are owing that much, and they're accumulating interest every day. So whatever is owed to them should be paid at the appropriate time, because they are also incurring interest. So I think we need to close our books in that respect. Right. But then also there are other challenges. Some of them are in terrains where it costs them so much more. Say, look at Bayelsa, for example. I wasn't surprised that Bayelsa is among the 6 poorest states according to the multi-dimensional index. And I was on the television with the governor of Gombe, and I was telling him that I see no reason why he should not do 500% more than Bayelsa if he gets the proceeds from the oil. This is because if you try to get 100 square meter of land by dredging, look at the cost of that. If you want to build bridge in those, it's so expensive. It will cost you about 500 million just to do 1 kilometer of road there. Whereas if you come out to the other areas, it's about 100 to 130 million dollars.
So how can the states be more economically viable?
So they have costs. They have costs that actually makes it difficult for them to be at par with other states. But of course, you will argue that's why you are having 13% more. But having said that, we all know what the key issues are in Nigeria. Is always the overflogged, that we need to diversify our economy, and that we need to move for export-led economic development strategy, because that means you start pulling on all the forces of production, because you are focusing on export, so quality takes the precedence. And that we need to invest in human resources. The best capital we have is human capital.
Absolutely.
Look at the diaspora remittance has come back to over $20 billion now. And we're not investing in human capital. We're not investing in health. We're not investing in employment. We have an embarrassing employment figure of 70% when you add both the unemployed and underemployed. It's crisis for the young people. Yeah,
a massive crisis, and that's let out a huge cry, and balancing the figures from the presidency. Professor Sam Amadi, is this argument, one of fiscal responsibility in the management of these funds here? Quickly.
Well,
yeah. Fiscal responsibility.
Fiscal responsibility in Nigeria is governed by Fiscal Responsibility Act 2007.
Absolutely.
And it focuses on accountability, transparency, and prudence in the management of our public finance resources. And in the case of this, is about after the law is at the federal level, about 23 states have actually domesticated that law with their FRC version, and we just want them to play the game so that there's a level playing field, and as well as singing from the same hymn book. But we have a challenge. The challenge that we have is that debt is on the exclusive legislative list. So you could see many governors crying out that they don't have they're always told that they don't have the capacity to borrow, but that they say that the federal government keeps borrowing, and so they're constrained. And you can understand the federal government doesn't want to allow the situation where some states will go bankrupt and suddenly they can't pay salary because the receivables are taken up by their debt service. So it's a catch-22 situation, but it is still a major issue.
But in spite of this, you have the finance minister, Zainab Ahmed, who says Nigeria is not broke. It's amazing.
No, Nigeria is not broke. No, I agree with her. Nigeria is not broke. Okay. What has happened in Nigeria is, first of all, our debt to GDP is reasonable, over 23%. But the thing is that we're having problem in having enough money to finance the debt. So the actual debt to government's revenue ratio is what is going out through the roof. But this is simply because we have been on debt financing. We haven't moved to asset-based financing. And what that means in effect, when the asset plays in, you find out that we're okay, we're very, very solvent. If you take the case of Saudi Aramco that needed only $25 billion, I didn't want to go borrowing. They said, look, tell me the value of Saudi Aramco. And when they told them, they said, oh, 1.5 trillion, sell 5%, take it to capital market. And they got the money. If you do the same for NNPC that is over $100 billion, take only 10%, you have enough money to solve all the problems that we have. You simply call in $10 billion. So we are asset rich, but we are not using that asset-based financing. That's the problem that we're having.
All right, let's quickly go back to our offsite studio now, where Professor Sam Amadi is back with us. Sam, I'd asked you the issue of the fiscal responsibility, and Professor Ken Ife had, endeavored to answer, some of it. What do you really think is missing, or the missing link in managing such humongous funds and applying that act of the Fiscal Responsibility Act?
Well, I think we might not be a very rich economy, but we have the responsibility to manage our resources very well. And the reason why we're not managing it well is because of the political structure of control, because of accountability. You see, we complain about corruption in the federal government, lack of accountability. But in the states, the House of Assembly are not accountable. All the vertical and horizontal accountability framework are not working in terms of NGO, citizen group, in terms of legislature, in terms of maybe the Auditor General's office, and so on. Now, if you look at places like Sierra Leone, a very poor country, in the last 1920 global multi-dimension poverty index, Sierra Leone has been the country that done the best in terms of improvement. Now, it hasn't got so much money. What do? They use the funds they have to provide basic sanitation in communities. So the problem is not that we don't have money. Yes, we need to grow the economy. Two ways to be economically viable is also grow the economy, also have more value for the buck. Spend their funds where it generates more growth for you, where it helps in building human capital. So the failure is the lack of accountability in terms of political institutions. In the states, the governors are totally in control. Now, imagine a governor who gives money to other states without appropriation. Imagine a governor who wakes up and provides 28 vehicles to a sister state because he's in love with the other governor. Imagine a governor who comes to a book launch of a journalist and gives 100 million for the state. This reckless behavior are because of lack of accountability. We're running a system where people in power basically think that they are running a private company. I mean, even private companies have rules, corporate governance, the shareholders, the layering of board control and all that. But here, they're simply in charge and do whatever they like with the money. So yes, we should focus on growing the economy, diversifying, expanding our productivity frontier through investment in human capital, innovation, and so on and so forth, through better use of external trade. But the most important thing at this point will be that we ensure that we rein in expenditure. We have the public procurement guidelines, we have all the fiscal rules. What we don't have is the political incentive, the development bargain. Are those governors really under constraint to focus, no matter how small resources they have, towards improving well-being? We've seen from countries, like I mentioned before, Sierra Leone did excellently well in terms of improvement. We've seen Liberia did very, very well. And it's interesting, the countries in the world that come first, the Scandinavians from Norway, are countries that have social democracy. They are countries who a level of equality, where accountability is culturally normed. People just govern well. It's not about only wealth, it's about political economy. Do have control over governors who are in those states. With this fund we have, each of these states will improve on poverty rating. It's simple to invest in human development. It's not too much money tag.
Human development, not airports and not flyovers, according to the presidency.
In the state's capital.
Thank you so much, both of you gentlemen. Professor Kenife, thank you very much. Dr. Sam Amadi, a rise analyst.